The following is a second look at an article entitled 5 Reasons to Suspect that Jesus Never Existed at Salon.com. The article itself does not contain anything groundbreaking to anyone who follows this debate, but it presents the most common objections. We will go over the 5 reasons author Valerie Tarico gives, and a response to each. 1. No first-century secular evidence whatsoever exists to support the actuality of Yeshua ben Yosef. Tarico uses only an extensive quote from skeptical biblical scholar Bart Ehrman, in which he explains that there are no first-century non-Jewish, non-Christian sources that mention Jesus. If this is proof that a historical Jesus never existed, then someone needs to tell this to Professor Ehrman. Let him speak for himself.
Did Julius Caesar exist? Did Cicero exist? Did Socrates or Aristotle or Mark Antony? Almost no one questions whether these people existed, so why is there so much controversy around the question, did Jesus exist? I can assure you, as a historian, that whatever else you might want to say about Jesus, he certainly existed. But he was a real person, and we can know some things about him. Skeptics like to say that we don't have the original texts of any of the Gospels of the New Testament, and we don't have any historical records of Jesus from his day. That's absolutely right, but it's also true of virtually everyone who lived at his time, including such powerful and important figures as Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea, and Josephus, the Jewish historian. The evidence for the historical Jesus, as for Pilate and Josephus, is overwhelming when looked at through the impartial lens of the historian.
This argument implies that the first-century documents contained in the New Testament are unreliable simply because they were written by Christians. But as Ehrman also points out, this would be a bit like dismissing early American accounts of the Revolutionary War simply because they were written by Americans. 2. The earliest New Testament writers seem ignorant of the details of Jesus' life, which become more crystallized in later texts. To make this point, Tarico picks on the fact that the Apostle Paul never mentions certain details about Jesus' life including his virgin birth, the wise men, or a star in the east. She goes on to explain. He virtually refuses to disclose any other biographical detail, and the few cryptic hints he offers aren't just vague, but contradict the Gospels. The leaders of the early Christian movement in Jerusalem like Peter and James are supposedly Jesus' own followers and family, but Paul dismisses them as nobodies and repeatedly opposes them for not being true Christians. The few cryptic hints he offers are major points about the life of Jesus. He really existed, was the Son of God, was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and that he rose from the dead. It's true that Paul does not give us more specific details about the life of Jesus, but that doesn't mean he wasn't aware of them. Claiming that he virtually refuses to disclose further details is speculative. He had no reason to rehash the gospel narrative in any of his letters. Paul was writing to specific churches as praise for right conduct and adherence to sound doctrine, or as correction to those who had strayed from the faith. Since his audience was already Christian, he may have assumed they were aware of the details about Jesus and saw no reason to elaborate. This is true in modern church documents. When a pastor or other clergy member writes a letter to another church, it's not likely they would feel the need to explain the life of Jesus in every detail to an audience already familiar with the story. They might reference specific details to make a point as Paul did, but letters of praise or correction from one Christian to another are not going to contain a complete retelling of the gospel narrative. And it would be absurd to expect them to. 3. Even the New Testament stories don't claim to be first-hand accounts. With this objection, Tarico claims that none of the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses, and that the attribution of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not designated until 100 years or more after Christianity began. If it was actually the case that author attributions were not chosen until many years after the time of Christ, then it is a curious thing that they did not choose more prominent disciples like Peter or James. The authors of the Gnostic Gospels chose the names of prominent disciples to lend credibility to their writings, but we know these couldn't have been written by the people they are attributed to, because they don't appear until 200 or 300 years later. The overwhelming majority of biblical scholars, on the other hand, place the authorship of at least 3 of the Gospels within a generation of Jesus, and all 4 of them definitely within the 1st century. Matthew and John were both eyewitnesses of the ministry of Christ, and that a strong case can be made that Mark and Luke both received their information from eyewitnesses. 4. The Gospels, our only accounts of a historical Jesus, contradict each other. Oceans of ink have been spilled on the subject of contradictions in the Bible from both sides of the debate. But the question remains, do these contradictions indicate that there may not have been a historical Jesus, upon which the core of the Gospels are based? I would argue that these contradictions valid, or not, have no bearing on the existence of a historical Jesus. Tarico points to discrepancies in the resurrection accounts as an example. Even if we are to concede that these accounts contain details that are impossible to reconcile, it still does nothing to prove that there was no Jesus. At best, it would only prove that one or all of the authors of the Gospels got their facts wrong. The core facts of the Gospels: that Jesus existed, preached and won disciples, and was crucified by Roman authorities is attested to in the writings of Paul, the early church fathers, the Jewish historian Josephus, and several other non-Christian authors. Even the enemies of Christianity never denied the existence of its founder. 5. Modern scholars who claim to have uncovered the real historical Jesus depict wildly different persons. This is probably the weakest of Tarico's points. If we asked 10 people to tell us about the life of a person they knew, and all of their descriptions deviated from one another in very important details, this would not in any way mean the person in question did not exist. Tarico continues her point. Jesus appears to be an effect, not a cause, of Christianity. Paul and the rest of the first generation of Christians searched the Septuagint translation of Hebrew scriptures to create a mystery faith for the Jews, complete with pagan rituals like a Lord's Supper, Gnostic terms in his letters, and a personal Savior God to rival those in their neighbors' long-standing Egyptian, Persian, Hellenistic and Roman traditions. There is a lot to unpack here. Many skeptics have claimed that there are parallels with the pagan religions of the time in the details about the life of Jesus and Christian rituals. In my own research, I have not found these parallels to be compelling. You can watch my own videos on these parallels. What I do find compelling is that the Christian movement managed to spread so quickly. The Jewish historian Josephus confirms that the movement began in Judea, while Tacitus, Suetonius, and Pliny the Younger tell us that it spread all the way to Rome and Bithynia. According to the writings of the early Christians, these new communities were started by apostles, who had been sent by the movement's founder, Jesus.